Okay, make a start. Welcome everyone. I'm Wim Van Mierlo and I'm Senior Lecturer here in the English Department at Loughborough. And thank you for braving the rain, which might have kept some people away, but yes, well, we've got names for them, don't we? Yes, thanks very much for coming here. Quite excited to have you all here. As an English department, we don't do that many public events. Maybe we should do more. But anyway, we're a vibrant, we're small but vibrant department. We're consistently in the top 10 of English departments in the country. Which keeps us busy. Particularly 2022 has been for some of us a busy year. Lots of centenaries, publication of some major works by lesser known people like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot. But Larkin is part of the annus mirabilis because he was born in 1922 and it's his centenary. So I'm very pleased and proud of the association and the opportunity that the Larkin Society has offered us to have Philip Pullen speak to you this evening and to bring you all here. This evening's event is part of the Larkin #Larkin100 events that the Larkin Society has been putting on up and down the country. But before we get to the serious bit, I think I wanted to make some time for poetry, and I'm going to be brazen enough to read one of Larkin's poems for you. And I've chosen The Whitsun Weddings not because it's probably Larkin's most famous and everyone's tired of it, but because it's a train poem. It describes a train journey from the north, I presume Hull, down to London. But I think only a poet who travelled regularly by train, i.e. between Hull and Loughborough, to visit his mum, only a train poet would have written this poem. So I'm gonna read that for you if you will allow me. So The Whitsun Weddings. That Whitsun I was late getting away. Not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday did my 3/4 empty train pull out. All windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed the street of blinding windscreens, smelled the fish dock, thence the river's level drifting breath began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet. All afternoon through the tall heat that slept for miles inland, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. Wide farms went by, short-shadowed cattle, and canals with floatings of industrial froth. A hothouse flashed uniquely, hedges dipped in rows, and now and then a smell of grass displaced the reek of buttoned carriage cloth until the next town, new and nondescript, approached with acres of dismantled cars. At first I didn't notice what a noise the weddings made. Each station we stopped at, sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade, and down the long cool platforms, whoops and skirls I took for porters larking with the mails, and went on reading. Once we started though, we passed them grinning and pomaded, girls in parodies of fashion, heels and veils, all posed irresolutely, watching us go, as if out of the end of an event, waving goodbye to something that survived it. Struck, I leant more promptly out next time, more curiously, and saw it all again in different terms. The fathers with broad belts under their suits and seamy foreheads, mothers loud and fat, an uncle shouting smut, and then the perms, the nylon gloves and the jewellery substitutes, the lemons, mauves, and Oliver ochres that marked off the girls uneasily from the rest. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls up yards and bunting-dressed coach party annexes, the wedding days would come to an end. All down the line, fresh couples climbed aboard. The rest stood round, the last confetti and advice were thrown, and as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull. Fathers had never known success so huge and wholly farcical. The woman shared a secret like a happy funeral, while girls, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at a religious wounding. Free at last and loaded with the sum of all they saw, we hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots and poplars cast long shadows over major roads. And for some 50 minutes, that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, I nearly died. A dozen carriages got underway. They watched the landscape sitting side by side. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl. And none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. I thought of London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed, and as we raced across bright knots of rail past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close, and it was nearly done, this frail to travelling coincidence, and what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We slowed again, and as the tightened brakes took hold, there swelled the sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Okay, right now on to business. It's my pleasure to introduce Philip Pullen to you. Philip's from Coventry, born and bred. He studied at the University College Swansea and the University of Leicester, and he holds a PhD in the sociology of education. Philip spent most of his working life teaching in further and higher education, and also served for 10 years as one of Her Majesty's inspectors. He now lives in Beverley, East Yorkshire, and is a trustee of the Philip Larkin Society and chair of Larkin 100, a charitable organisation established to promote and coordinate a year-long celebration of the work of Philip Larkin during this centenary year. Philip is also a Larkin writer and researcher and has intimate knowledge of the Philip Larkin archive that is held at the Hull History Centre. And in 2017 he worked as an advisor for the highly acclaimed New Eyes Each Year exhibition at the University of Hull, curated by Anna Farthing. His research interests are focused on Larkin's family life, and particularly that of his mother, Eva Larkin. He's now working on a literary travelogue, which sounds terribly intriguing, based on the significant places in Philip Larkin's life, and that's what brings him back to Loughborough today as well. Certainly Philip has had a busy year this year. He's given talks on various literary events and conferences, Belfast, Guernsey, Wellington Literary Festival, etc., 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 Dorchester as well. And he's also taken part in several episodes of Tiny in All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast, which are well worth listening to. Philip's also he's a writer, published author, and he's written several articles on Larkin, as well as on Larkin and his mother, including two recent ones that have appeared in books. One, Thanks for Typing, Remembering Forgotten Women in History, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2021, and also Writers and Their Mothers, published by Macmillan in 2018. But without further ado, Dearest Old Creature, the life of Emilie Larkin. Philip, over to you.
Thanks very much, Wim. And hi, everyone. And thanks. And what a brilliant way to start off with the Whitsun Weddings. You can never get tired of that poem. And actually, do you know there is a Loughborough connection with that poem? Because the journey which inspired Larkin to write that poem wasn't actually from Hull to London. It was from Hull to Loughborough, and he got off the train at Grantham because he was going to visit his mother for the weekend. it wasn't an easy journey, that particular one, because he got off at Grantham and he was supposed to be catching a train to Loughborough, but that was cancelled or something happened. He ended up getting a lift with a farmer to Melton Mowbray, and then he got a bus from Melton Mowbray to Loughborough, which is actually the way that Larkin travelled around a lot of his world, if you like. But anyway, I'm really, really pleased to be in Loughborough. I mean, one of the things that I was sort of aiming to do with Larkin 100, which is the hashtag we're using to sort of focus the centenary year. One of the things I was trying to do was to make sure that we got Larkin involved in one way or another with every place that he's associated with. And Loughborough is a really key one from that point of view, particularly because of this lady, Emilie Larkin, Larkin's mother. So Larkin visited Loughborough on many, many occasions. And, I visited Loughborough on many occasions as well, sometimes in an official capacity as an Ofsted inspector, I have to say. I've visited the college quite often, but to also pursue this research into Larkin. And so I always thought it was a great place to do a talk and indeed to have a walk. And Lynne led a fantastic walk today around Loughborough, which some of you I know were on, and that was really good because it was another one of those ideas. We had a good time, didn't we, on that? So anyway, this is mainly about Eva Larkin, but it's actually about the relationship between Eva and her son Philip. So most people think they know exactly what Philip Larkin thought about parents and what they do to you. But are they right? And there's been quite a lot of the biographical writings about Larkin that have concentrated on his family background and the ways in which his parents, Sidney and Eva, significantly shaped his life. Larkin himself set them off on this course, really, because as a 20-year-old in 1943, he wrote to his friend Jim Sutton expressing a particular view of his parents and how they were incessantly opposed within him. That photograph, by the way, was taken obviously later in life. Written on the back of that print, Larkin had actually written, "Happy as the day is long." But that doesn't tell you everything about Larkin's views of his parents. But this is also what he said in that letter to Jim Sutton. It intrigues me that a 30-year struggle is being continued in me and in my sister too. In her it has reached a sort of conclusion, my father winning. Pray the Lord that my mother is superior in me. So I think there is evidence that Larkin's mother was probably the most important woman in his life, actually, and a fundamental factor in him becoming the kind of writer that he was. But if you take the biographies into account, I don't think you necessarily get that picture, because biographers have been more preoccupied with Larkin's father, Sidney. That's Sidney, in an official photograph when he was the city treasurer of Coventry Corporation, as it was in those days. The interest in Sidney has been partly around the fact that his political background was of some concern. He was enthusiastic about National Socialism in the 1930s, and there's a concern about the impact that would have had on his son, along with the fact that he was also interested in quite a few of the what you might call progressive elements of English literature in that time when Larkin was growing up. He was enthusiastic about Hardy, he was enthusiastic about D.H. Lawrence, Catherine Mansfield, people like that. So all those books were in Larkin's house, and they were all things which were important. And by comparison to Sidney, Eva is generally presented as a sort of passive background figure, nervous, heavily controlled and barely tolerated by her husband, continuously whining and contributing to this unhappy pairing. And some of the things that Larkin himself says gives that impression. But I think that's over stereotyped. In fact, even that photograph that I chose there is not the one you'd normally see of Eva. You'd probably see her more in a kind of domestic setting than that. That's her in the study in either Warwick, the house in Warwick, or Coventry. I think important aspects of her life and the experiences that shaped her character haven't really been fully taken into account. What struck me most about this when I first came to look at it was the almost complete absence of her own voice. You don't get to hear Eva. You don't get to read that many of her words. There's no consideration of any sort of agency behind her life, what she did and what she didn't do. We're not told much about what she thought or what she felt about things. And I think that leaves us with an incomplete and in some respects inaccurate picture of Eva as a person. And that's one of the things that I've really wanted to focus on in what I've been writing, because I think you can argue that Eva Larkin had a profound effect on Philip Larkin's life, both directly and indirectly, contributing to his success as a writer. Now, Wim's already mentioned the History Centre in Hull. For anybody who's a Larkin enthusiast, you're very well off if you want to look at the archives, because they're all, more or less, in Hull. The History Centre is a fantastic place. It's run jointly by the University of Hull and Hull City Council, so it holds all the city archives as well as the university archives. And if you want to study Larkin, you don't have to go anywhere else but Hull. Well, you could go to the Bodleian, actually. You might go to Belfast. I've got the odd letter there. But you don't. If you were studying Ted Hughes, you'd be way off to America or, as many other people. But it's all in Hull. And for anybody who loves archives, it's just fantastic. There are thousands of items relating to the Larkin family. But then here's the point about selectivity, because when it comes to material directly related to Eva, not all of the items within there have been fully catalogued, and there's about 8,000 of them. Letters, postcards, telegrams, which they wrote to each other from the time that Philip went up to Oxford in 1940 to shortly before her death in 1977. It's a vast archive, and it's not just letters, photographs, diaries, audio recordings, and a lot of that material I'm using as a basis for what I want to talk about this evening. So until recently, the family letters haven't been that accessible. When Anthony Thwaite took the sort of decision that he was going to publish an edition of the selected letters, he deliberately left out the family letters because he thought there was too many of them. It was difficult to do. He regretted it afterwards. I remember him saying at one point he regretted it. And they came out in 1993. And Andrew Motion, who wrote the first biography of Philip Larkin in 1993, he used the letters, but very selectively. And then James Booth, another Larkin biographer, did produce an edition of the letters, I think in 2016. But it's an edition. And inevitably, as an edition, you can't include 8,000 letters. There's no way. It's big enough a book as it is. But the other thing about it is the bulk of the letters in Letters Home, which is the edition of the family letters, the bulk of the letters are from Philip's side of the conversation. There are, I think it's 607 letters in total, and only a handful of those letters in full are written by Eva. What James Booth does is to include a number of quotations from Eva's letters as footnotes throughout the edition, as a means of providing context as much as anything. But what the problem is, I think, with that particular approach is that you don't get Eva's voice properly heard. You're only getting snippets. And it seriously decontextualizes what she's talking about. And it takes quite a perceptive reader to piece it all together again, to make sense of the conversation in full. You miss the nuances and so on. So we still have that problem. And then I think that, I thought there was a problem when I first started to consider this, is whether Eva Larkin would have wanted her story told. But I think there are hints that she might. because she told Philip on several occasions that she wanted to be a writer and had started to write the story of her life. She didn't get very far, but this is one of the pages of Eva's own account of her childhood in a notebook in the History Centre. She never got beyond the childhood. So what does a closer read reveal about Eva Larkin? How does it change our perspective on her as a person? Does it change our perception and the significance of her life for the literary success of her son? Well, let's begin with a little bit of background. Well, we know that she actually is a Lancastrian, but with Essex roots. She was born in Loughborough in Lancashire, but soon after her birth, the family moved to her father's county of origin, Essex, and she spent her childhood days in a place called Thaden Garden, a village near Harlow. Most of it's now disappeared underneath the M25, but this is a photograph. Eva is there. That's Eva, and that's her brother Arthur. That's her mother, Emilie. The first Emilie. The spelling of Emilie is an interesting one because Eva moves between the French spelling with the IE and an English spelling, and so did her mother. But on a birth certificate is spelt with an IE. Anyway, and that's a maid. So the family was relatively well off. But by her teens, the family had moved back to Lancashire, to the town of Lee, where she attended Lee Grammar School. She's one of the first girls to attend Lee Grammar School, so that in itself is quite an achievement, I think. And she continued to live in Lee until she married Sidney Larkin in August 1911. Eva's father, William Day, was a customs and excise officer, and he was the reason for the moves to and from Lancashire. He started his working life actually as a pupil teacher in London, but quickly moved into the civil service, and he held posts in several parts of the British Isles, including Dublin, Dumfries and Hammersmith. And he met Eva's mother, Emilie, while working in Coventry, which is one of those strange sort of quirky things that you get. And they were actually married in 1883 in St Michael's Church in Coventry, which is now Coventry Cathedral. And later on in life, Philip Larkin would be christened in Coventry Cathedral. So that interesting link with Coventry happening. Eva had a younger brother, Arthur. And this to my mind is the most interesting of the photographs in the archive. It's nowhere listed. It's in a box of photographs shown in, but that is Arthur. He seems such a character to me. He also attended the grammar school in Lee and became an elementary school teacher in Ashton-under-Lyne. But he died relatively young, aged 53 in 1943. He died of a burst appendix. The weird thing is, neither Eva nor Philip say very little about him, their correspondence, although their childhood memories of him, her childhood memories of him are quite strong and happy ones, and there seemed to be a closeness between the two of them, and also during the early years of their married life. But after that, Arthur disappears from the correspondence, and there's hardly any mention of him. And yet, Eva's sister-in-law, Nellie, was a very close friend of Eva throughout their life, and Nellie would come to Loughborough every Christmas. But Arthur doesn't get mentioned. But that photograph is a very strange one. I've read some of the letters he wrote to Eva, Arthur's letters to Eva, and he does come across as being, I don't know, sometimes you think there's a sort of personality around a primary school teacher. I've got several people in my family who were primary school teachers, and I think you need to have a certain sense of humour to be a primary school teacher. And from the letters, I think Arthur had that kind of jokey sense of humour that can see things from a child's level, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, that's Arthur. And some Larkin biographers, Andrew Motion started this off, assumed that after leaving school, Eva also became a teacher. But there's no evidence for this being the case. In fact, her own account that you get from the letters suggests that she spent most of her late teens and early 20s supporting her mother, who suffered increasingly from ill health. Her mother developed diabetes and gangrene and died in 1934 following an unsuccessful operation to remove a leg. So there was there was a sense in which Eva was the person who had to stay at home to look after her mother. But by her own admission, Emilie Day, that is Eva's mother, was to have another, even more profound effect on her daughter's life, because it was through her that she came to meet and marry Sidney Larkin. That's a photograph from the archive, and on the back of that photograph, Eva has written, "The year I met Daddy." They always referred to Sidney as Daddy. That's the way that she referred to him in letters to Philip. Trying to pull this together, what do we know about the way that Sidney and Eva met up, how it came to be? Well, we get a description of it in a letter that Philip Larkin wrote to Monica Jones, his long-term lover and companion. He wrote in August 1953, talking about how his parents met. "He met my mother on the beach at Rhyl. He was there for 3 days only on a cycling tour, but before leaving he had a picture of them taken together and exchanged addresses. And despite a separation of several years, his intentions didn't alter. I find all that very strange and romantic, partly because unlike the father I knew." So that was Larkin's account. But beyond that account, until quite recently, the precise nature of the meeting has never been properly examined. But if we draw on some of the other items in the Larkin archive, things which haven't really been looked at very much, you can throw some more light on this obviously important meeting and discover some surprising, significant clues about the poetic influence on Larkin at the same time. So if we start with this photograph, this photograph that Eva had written on the back, "The year I met Daddy." So if it's the year she met Daddy, we know that it must have been taken in 1906. Eva's on the extreme left. Extreme right, wearing the straw boater, of course, why not, is Arthur, her brother. He's seated next to her mother, Emilie. And I thought the man next to Eva must be Eva's father, William, but I'm actually not so sure now. I think it could well be Sidney Larkin. Because if we compare it with this picture of Sidney, which you'll see was taken in August 1906, so it's the same year, I think it might be him. We can see a similarity, particularly with that drooping moustache. So, the picture postcard there was actually a picture postcard sent from Rhyl by Sidney to his brother Alfred and postmarked August the 9th, 1906. There's a significance in that date. It's another one of those dates that somehow, there's suddenly something. Do you know the significance of the August the 9th date? You're nodding your head, so you must know.
Philip's birthday.
Philip's birthday, yeah, exactly, yeah. So just happenstance that he sent this on Philip's birthday. I think when I look at that photograph, that Larkin's poem "To the Sea" and that line, "the miniature gaiety of seasides," it just seems to me that it kind of captures some of that. Now then, there's a link between all of these things and this. Arthur Cheetham. Like many during the Edwardian era, Emilie Day, Eva's mother, took a deep interest in mind reading, in astrology and fortune telling. She was deeply, passionately interested in those things. And one of those elements of her passion was phrenology. That was the theory that a person's character could be determined on the basis of the shape of the human head. And it was a very popular pseudoscience in those days. And Arthur Cheetham was a phrenologist. but he was several other things as well. He gave lectures on real sands. He was also a pioneering filmmaker. His is the oldest surviving footage of an association football match, Blackburn Rovers versus West Bromwich Albion, 1898. In 1906, he just opened the first cinema in Rhyl. But I'm not just being speculative on this, because buried in the Larkin archive, there's another source of information that tells us much more about this meeting. In May 1961, Philip tape recorded a conversation with his mother during a stay in his Pearson Park flat in Hull. And the recording's rarely been heard in its entirety, but it's just got an amazing amount of information in it, and I'm going to play you a section of it. This is Eva's account of that holiday in Rhyl, and you can imagine what it felt like when I first listened to this, because it's like you find the other bit of the jigsaw.
You know, holidays were funny in those days because you never went, we didn't. We used to go and do our own catering. Mother would go out in the morning and buy what she thought we'd like for lunch, and buy a pie, lovely pies from the confectioners, and then bring some cream in with it. And then give the chops or whatever it was to the landlady to cook. And then off she'd go to Mr. Cheetham and listen to this this phrenologist. And she'd be there all morning and then go in for lunch. And that's how I met Daddy, you see. I went to look for Mother. I thought she was sure to be here somewhere. She always says it was through her that I met Daddy. It was funny, that was. I stood on the fringe of the crowd, you know, just idly listening. And Daddy was there listening. You wouldn't think he'd be at a thing like that, would you?
No, there's not
And he used to get people to come up, you see, and give them a free reading of their heads, just for the crowd, you see, to draw attention. And he got another one. Mother went up one day. And before he said anything, he said, "Marvellous, marvellous." Mother's character. Oh, yeah. Because then she wanted us all to go up after that. I did go up, but he didn't say anything very special about me. Except that I was very tidy and should never marry a Johnny with the cuffs right down to his fingernails. Because they wore the cuffs in those days, starch cuffs.
I don't know what Pop was doing there. Come to scoff, I suppose.
Yes, because he said to me they're all in league, I expect.
A very typical remark.
And I said, I don't think so, like that, as if I'd known him for years. He said that was what surprised him, that I spoke so naturally, as if I'd known him ages. Instead of glaring at him and thinking, well, fancy speaking to me, stranger.
And then you met him again the next day?
I don't know, I think it was the next. I was alarmed when I found him walking beside me when we went away. When the crowd dispersed, I found him walking along with me, and I thought, oh dear. Then he asked me where we were staying and all that, and said he was on a cycling tour. I never thought any more about it until the next day, and I was reading on the prom. And there he stood, looking at me, and I looked up, and the shadow fell over the book I was reading, which was Wuthering Heights. He said, "You don't know me this morning." And I said, "Well, you've changed your clothes."
Why are
Anyway.
you reading Wuthering Heights?
Well, I think I fancied it, you know. I thought I'd like to read it. And then he saw my initials at the front, E.E.D., and he couldn't guess what they stood for. And I said Day. He said, "Oh, there was a character in Hardy named Day."
Oh. Yeah.
Fancy Day.
Had you ever heard of Hardy then?
No, only then Daddy recommended me to read. What did I read first? I think it was Under the Greenwood Tree.
Hmm.
And then I read Tess, and then I got Mother to read it, and she couldn't read it. It upset her so much she had to give it up. No, it made her so miserable, Tess did.
And when did he meet your mother?
Well, the last day he was at Rill.
That must
He
have
was
been
only there about 3 days.
That must have been an ordeal.
It was. I saw him turn on his heel and I thought, oh dear, that's finished it now. He sees Mother's coming in sight. Yes, she was a bit, she said, "I think we ought to see this man you've been going out with," because we'd been to the Pier concert one night.
Hmm.
And I didn't fancy it really. I thought he'd think I'd brought her specially, you see, to trap him, as it might be. And I saw him turn swiftly round and walk the other way, and then he came back again. I think it must have upset him a bit, and he tried to calm himself.
What did your father think of him?
Oh, he liked him.
It must have been clear he was a very remarkable man, I suppose.
Yes, and strangely enough, he liked my father. He liked him better than anyone in our family. He thought he was the cleverest man he'd ever met, he told me. Funny, wasn't it? Because he
I never had the advantage of knowing me in my best years.
That's Philip Larkin trying to do a Yorkshire accent at the end there. He was a great mimic, actually, but I mean, clearly that stuck in his mind, you know, and years later, that seaside coming together would be actually recalled in the poem To the Sea, which Larkin composed after a seaside holiday with his mother in August 1969. And contained within that poem is a secret reference to Mr. Cheetham. Because there are these lines in the poem: "As when happy at being on my own, I searched the sand for famous cricketers." Or, farther back, "My parents, listeners to the same seaside quack, first became known." Now, you wouldn't know who the seaside quack was unless you had that little insight from that piece of archive. You know, that's why I think it's important. Now, the picture that Larkin presented of his parents' life together is, of course, extremely negative. He saw them as temperamentally unsuited, and he describes how their sort of initial high romantic ideals soon gave way to coldness. He described this situation to Monica Jones. He told her that he couldn't recall his parents making a single spontaneous gesture of affection towards each other. But again, if you look at Eva's accounts, you get a slightly different perspective coming out, certainly in her letters. Recollected in widowhood, so that may be significant too. But you can find some quite positive examples of sort of conjugal togetherness in their relationship. They enjoyed visits to the cinema together and the theatre, particularly after Sydney retired. And she has happy recollections of going to conferences and dances in the 1930s. It's quite interesting, though, that most of her happy memories are before Philip was born, as if that was a thing, I don't know. But thinking of spontaneous gestures, well, that photograph's interesting, I suppose, but this card is, I think, a really interesting discovery, really. She sent this a Valentine's card to Sydney as he was dying in hospital in February 1948. Inside the card, she has written, "Something has prompted me to send you a Valentine. It must have been the first I've ever bought. I hope it will please and surprise you. I look forward so very much to our tea party each afternoon. I should find a whole day without you too dreadful." Now, I mean, that to me is quite astonishing that kind of emotion was coming out, because she didn't really give that much emotion away, but there you are. Anyway, Sydney Larkin died aged 63 on Good Friday, 26th of March 1948, of cancer of the liver. It's been quite a quick decline, and it left Eva severely depressed, unable to cope alone. So this is when she moved, first of all, to Loughborough, and she lived temporarily with her daughter Kitty and her family in York Road at 53 York Road. Kitty had moved to Loughborough in 1944. She'd married. Her husband, I think at the time, worked at the college. He was an engineer. She taught at the college. They bought a house together in York Road, 53 York Road. But Eva was clearly aware that that couldn't be a permanent thing, because Kitty had a young daughter at the time, too, Rosemary. She wrote to Philip in May 1948, "I know I ought not to burden Kitty and you with my worries, but it's the only way that I can keep my balance. You have both done so much for me already that I am further filled with remorse and hope you will both forgive me." There were two options, practically. One was to continue to live with Kitty and the family. And the second, which was the one that happened, was to live with Philip. He was at the time working as a sub-librarian at University College Leicester. So that's what they did. And they bought a house together in Dixon Drive in Leicester. That's how it looked earlier this year. And that's Eva, photographed by Philip on the first day, the day they moved in. Not a very good photograph, and she doesn't look particularly happy there. And the emotional state of both partners wasn't conducive to a happy coming together. I mean, probably for Eva it provided a degree of comfort and security and a few routines. She quite liked living in Leicester, because she said she reminded her of bits of Coventry. She found the area where they lived around Evington Road was a community of shops and the doctors and stuff like that she could go to. But it wasn't good for Philip. He wrote to his friend Jim Sutton that he was thinking of sending his mother to a local psychologist. This was in October 1949, because he said, after 20 months she doesn't seem any better and it's grinding us all down. And he did, in fact, find a local psychologist of sorts. This is where Dr Edith Folwell, practical psychologist, comes in to the scene. And I'm very grateful to Lynne. Lynne has done quite a lot of work on Edith Folwell, but you've got further than I have in some of this. And if you look at Lynne's blog post, she's done a couple of blogs about Dr Folwell. Dr Folwell described herself as a practical psychologist, and she was very well known and respected in the Leicester area. She was a product of the popular movement that developed in the aftermath of the First World War, which was aimed at promoting a version of psychological thinking mixed with an element of spiritualism as a means of improving well-being, individual well-being. And she gave lectures across the whole of the Midlands to a number of local psychology clubs, but also in churches, various denominations of churches. And further afield, I found she was doing some work up in Newcastle and other places too. And she'd be speaking on topics like finding, freeing your real self, or how to get and maintain the positive outlook. And she offered private consultations for people suffering from nervous ailments. So actually, as you can see from that quote there from Eva, that Philip Larkin was the person who introduced her to Dr Folwell. Now, I can't find anywhere a photograph of this woman. And also, she's not listed in the British Psychological, is it called British Psychological Society or Association list of psychologists? So I don't know whether she really was who she said she was, but these are a couple of things I found from the newspaper library. Here you see she gave a talk in Coventry once. This is a typical talk, life begins at 40. This thing about self-affirmation, etc. The other fascinating thing, though, is she was the mother of an actor in The Archers, a famous actor in The Archers, Dennis Folwell. He was a Leicester actor. He played Jack Archer. That's Dennis up there on the right. And both Eva and Philip were great fans of The Archers, so they were aware of that connection. Whether it did her any good, and we'll come back to her a bit later, but here's a quote from a letter from Philip to Eva, really sort of putting her off going for another course of treatment, because he didn't think it was doing her any good. But anyway, she did go for treatment, and she did also attend psychology lectures given by Dr Folwell, both in Leicester and in Loughborough. I forget, where were they in Loughborough? Where did you say they were today?
On Woodgate.
Woodgate, yeah. Yeah, that's where she would go. And then, beginning of June 1950, Philip had to break the bad news to her that he was appointed to a post at Queen's University of Belfast. That was his escape route. She said in her diary, "I'm pleased, but don't know whatever I shall do without him." And by the middle of August 1950, the house had been sold and arrangements made for Eva to move back with Kitty and her family. Rosemary, her granddaughter, was 3 years old by that time. Eva knew, of course, only too well that that wouldn't be a permanent arrangement, and there was an added pressure on that. She knew too that Philip didn't want her to come and live with him in Belfast, though she would have liked to do that. So what she began to do was to look for a live-in companion or paying guest, which is what a lot of widowed people would have been doing in the 1950s. And this is actually an advert she put in the Loughborough Echo. Actually, that's a cutting that she sent to Philip in one of the letters, but I found it in the archive as well in Loughborough. That was her advert for a companion. Now, the accounts in the letters of the people that she encountered during this search are both sad and also quite amusing, I suppose. And it's easy to imagine the alarming effect they would have on Philip when she was writing to him in Belfast about who she was meeting. This is one from one of the letters. "I expect you are wondering how I got on with Mrs. Pell on Monday. I felt rather disappointed when she arrived, as she looked much older than me and very countrified. Her husband was a gardener at one of the hostels of Loughborough College. Her age was 74, and I don't think she's quite what I'm looking for. The two new persons on the horizon are strangely both called Gamble. One is a man who wonders if I would kindly correspond with him regarding my advert, which correspondence, he says, must be private but respectable. I haven't answered because I definitely advertised for a lady." So I think Philip wrote back and said, don't take the gamble or something like that. But eventually she would find a house in York Road, just 100 yards or so up from where Kitty lived. And this is Eva outside 21 York Road. That car is Philip Larkin's car, as far as I can tell. He didn't learn to drive till 64. Before that, he would visit her, usually coming down on the train, I think. But that's his car. That's her outside 21 York Road. And
his age or year?
Sorry?
It's not been funny. Was it his age or year that he learned to drive? Was he 64 when he learned to drive?
Yeah, he's 1960. No, 90. The year 1964. Yeah. So he'd be 42, wouldn't he? Something. Yeah. Yeah, but it was quite late in life to learn to drive. He wasn't a very good driver either, I have to say. This is the family. This is that's Kitty on the left there. Walter, her husband, behind. Obviously Philip Larkin and Eva and Rosemary. And in that photograph, which I think is, both those photographs are probably taken in the garden in York Road, 21 York Road, that is Nellie. So that's Arthur's wife there. And Nellie was a visitor, frequent visitor there. So despite the prolonged attempts to find a paying guest, she never did find one. And so therefore, you know, she had quite a lonely life really, and despite her daughter's proximity, the real thing that kept her going was the communication with Philip, because they would write to each other by letter. They'd write letters to each other, usually about twice a week. And that became a vital part, I would say, of both of their existences really. It began to establish an important bond between them. There's a few examples of the things that they would send to each other. Philip's letters are full of doodles and drawings, and that's a postcard he sent to York Road. That's one of Eva's letters, talking about Dostoevsky's The Possessed. I mean, you know, we'll come to the literary thing in a minute, but she would have often talk about things like that. And they would send each other greetings telegrams, because that's what you did in those days. You wouldn't be able to send a quick text. You'd be sending, if you wanted to send something out quickly, you'd be sending a telegram. I think one of the fascinating aspects of this sort of shared conversation is actually the way the letters to each other are mirrored. They're very similar in style and content. Both of them would typically start to write letters with the other person's correspondence obviously in front of them, so they could answer the points in them. They'd often make some reference to the weather in both cases. They'd contain an ocean of commonplace trivia, day-to-day detail, on both sides really. Details of faulty gas fires, for example here, difficult encounters with her neighbours on Eva's side, and the language they used to address each other, things like the greetings, dear creature, dearest old creature, both of them use that phrase. And colloquial expressions coming in again, both sides of the conversation. Fancy that, you get them saying. I was interested to note that. Lots of the ways they write are mirrored. Similar thematic focus too. Often their gloomy, pessimistic outlook towards life comes across. But they acted as a sort of listening point for each other's woes and day-to-day concerns, and offered some kind of solution to them. Eva wrote to Philip in 1951, when I read the first part of your Sunday morning letter, I felt as I imagine you felt, somewhat sad that you appear to have no real aim in life. I do wish you had something, or could do something, that made each day worth living. When I read your beautiful passages in your letter, and there were several this week, I felt in spite of all, you are enjoying life, and that you are destined to be a poet. So there's this kind of building up, Philip's confidence perhaps. And what is really surprising to me, bearing in mind the biographies, is that Eva's letters have quite a bookish quality to them. She was well read, and often quite adventurous in her choice of reading matter. I mean, you go back to that recording and, reading Wuthering Heights. I mean, she chose to read Wuthering. People didn't tell her to read it. And very soon after her move to Loughborough, she joined the public library. That's a cutting from 1965, when the library was extended, that she sent to Philip. But you'll see that quote at the top there. I've also joined the public library here. This was 1950. Of course, I feel like a fish out of water when I go to choose a book. I put my name down for D.H. Lawrence's The Woman Who Rode Away. I can't get Dostoevsky's The Possessed at present. I've got 5 books out, E.M. Delafield's Nothing is Safe and The Optimist, 3 books on psychology. So she's reading an awful lot. Her son, given he was a librarian, wasn't always the best borrower. This is a card sent from the Central Library, issuing a fine for a book he'd taken out and hadn't returned. I'm afraid you were a naughty creature, else how can I account for this card? Yeah, so there you go. Eva's reading taste, as I said, was surprisingly broad, and she found particular interest in books that reflected aspects of her own plight. So in February 1964, she sent Philip a cutting from the Church Times. She was a great Church Times reader, which contained a poem written by Anthony Thwaite. And Anthony Thwaite became a great friend of Philip Larkin, one of his executors, and published the selected letters and so on. This was the poem she found written by Anthony Thwaite. After the usual rounds at night in the house and properly called my own, front door, back door bolted tight, fire raked down, stove stoked high. She said, I wasn't really interested so much in Anthony Thwaite, but in the verse he'd written. It made me think of my nightly locking up. What she used to do was she couldn't stand living on her own much in 21 York Road. So in the evening at some point she'd lock up the house and off she'd go to Kitty's house, 100 yards up the road, and stay overnight there. Philip had once told Monica that his mother had learned some of Hardy's poems simply to please my father. But her correspondence indicates this was never a mere gesture to impress, but a way to express emotion or relate to a situation. So this she wrote to him in 1944, I hope you too will feel the benefit of the little change, and will have, like Thomas Hardy in his poem In the 70s, a certain inward vision that will cast a magic eye on your goings to and fro. Do you know this one? I think it's a marvellous one and not usually quoted. And when you compare Eva's letters to Sydney's letters regarding literature, you find that she's got a much more emotionally engaged quality with what she's reading, whereas I think Sydney was much more familiar with the outsides of books than he was the inside in some respects. So I think it's not stretching things too far to attribute Philip's own emotional sensitivity directly to his mother's influence. On a couple of occasions, she uses literary quotations to reflect on the state of marriage, always an awkward thing with Philip Larkin. He wanted to avoid it at all cost. Here's a quote she included from George Bernard Shaw. I've just finished reading Love Among the Artists by GBS, in which occurs this passage. No, it is marriage that kills the heart and keeps it dead. Better starve the heart than overfeed it. Better still to feed it only on fine food like music. In a way, I agree with him, but I think when one is old and left alone, it is then that one feeds on the love and romance of past years. Better to have lived a full life, I think. Now, when that was first published in one of the articles I wrote, one of the critics seized on it and saying this was a crafty plan on Eva's part to warn Philip not to marry Monica. But I'm not sure the intention was that clear. I think it's ambiguous and intentionally so, maybe. Might they not reflect her own marriage experiences? That might be the case. Over the years, though, she would read Philip's own work with a position of extreme pride. Sometimes critically, but not really. That was more Monica's role, I suppose. But she was his great champion. And she talks about the two novels the first novel he wrote, Jill, she wrote in 1946. Well, I have read Jill and I like it very much indeed. I think it beautifully written and some parts deliciously fresh and pleasing. The bow tie episode is very good, and also the point where Jill takes shape in his mind. I felt very sad over the many times she eluded John and wished so much for a happy end to all his worries. Then the second novel, A Girl in Winter. Eva commented on the line where Miss Parbury moved her head along her long neck like a timid animal. I did wonder whether you were thinking of me, she said. So she is associating with it. But what comes across probably more strongly than that in the letters is this whole struggle she had to try and establish and cope with a new identity, that of being a widow, at a time when that status was probably more circumscribed than it is today. And she did an awful lot to try and cope with that. On her own, I feel. She turned to the sorts of interests and activities that you probably wouldn't think surprising for a middle-class elderly woman in a Midlands provincial town. But given the circumstances of their family life in the past and the powerful controlling influence that her husband and probably her father had over her, I think he was quite a challenge. And I think it shows that she did take steps herself to try and cope with the situation. So if we look at Eva's world in Loughborough in that sense, outside of her daily contact with her daughter's family, which was quite important, the rest of it revolved largely around the local church or churches and the various social organisations which they embodied or were related to it. So she joined various societies in Loughborough, the Sewing Club, women's friendly groups. She attended whist drives and church fetes. And she met most of her friends through these activities. And she did actually build up quite a number of similar women, I suppose, in terms of age and situation, i.e. either widowed or spinstered. And that was her way of trying to cope. It was always a struggle, but it gave her some life of her own, some identity. Attending church services on a Sunday was a very regular activity, which is interesting in the context of Larkin's life and background. Larkin loved church buildings, but was at best an agnostic. His father was a very definite, signed-up atheist. Eva's childhood seemed to have had church within it, but then she was constrained by marriage to some degree. But when she came to Loughborough, she started going to church regularly. She started taking communion regularly. She chiefly attended All Saints' Church. But from time to time, she shifted her allegiance to the other churches in the town, depending largely on the whims of her friends and what they thought about the clergy. If they've fallen out with the rector, then they might move on to another church. But it was also a question of where it was easy to get to. She wrote in 65, "I'm very fond of All Saints, but wish it was not quite so far off. In good weather, I enjoy the walk there and come home down Churchgate so I can look at all the shops." And this is the thing about the rector. This is Mrs. Dexter. I need to find out more about Mrs. Dexter. Mrs. Dexter lived on, I've forgotten where it is now. I'll remember in a minute. We went down it twice today. It'll come back. It'll come back. Anyway, Mrs. Dexter was a great friend. Mrs. Dexter does not like the alterations that the rector intends making at All Saints. Neither does she like the rector. She says he makes her bristle. I don't mind the change, but I think Emmanuel is nearer and the service much the same as All Saints. So she swapped around a little bit. It's bugging me that I can't remember the name of the retreat she was in. Well, Frederick Street, that's it, Frederick Street, yeah. But apart from the social aspects of this activity of going to church, I think it's the case that she did find some kind of some spiritual significance in attending, however vague and uncertain it was. And this is where we get back to the practical psychology movement and Dr. Folwell. Because the events she went to, the practical psychology group meetings, were very similar in many ways to church services. Not necessarily the content, but the social bit, because they provided a meeting place for social engagement. Tea and cake mingled with inspirational talks designed to improve individual well-being. And Eva still visited Dr. Folwell, as we've said. The other thing, though, is that Dr. Folwell led a spiritually orientated prayer group, which Eva attended, called the Circle of Silent Ministry. And I cannot find out any more about that. In the archive, there is a book full of prayers. What they did was they prayed for people who needed praying for. It's like a bit of a spiritual group. But it was all coming through Dr. Folwell. In fact, her appreciation of this type of psychological, spiritual enlightenment even led to her recommending it to Philip. In a 9-page letter written in March 1951, she was reflecting on Philip's own disillusioned spirits. He'd written to her from Belfast, bemoaning the scarcity of good companions and feeling what he said was clay-cold depression. "You know, Philip," she told him, "I cannot help thinking that you would benefit from a course in psychology. When one has reached the very depth of depression, psychology and religion are the last remaining props." He didn't take up her recommendation. And in the end, in any case, it didn't really help Eva either. She was trapped in memories of the past to some degree, aspects of her upbringing, and no doubt her relationship with Sydney. She wrote, I cannot get right. Although I go to the psychology lectures and the church functions, I always feel miserable about it and sort of half-hearted. And yet I think psychology is a clever science, and I like going to church and enjoy some of the social functions, but somehow my past life stands between and prevents me from enjoying it to the full. What would Daddy think? And her struggle got worse. Her level of depression and anxiety got worse, and they reached a peak in 1955, and it culminated in a short stay in a psychiatric hospital in Narborough. In Leicester, but it's on Narborough Road, I think, where she was subjected, as women particularly were in those days, to electric shock treatment with no discernible improvement on her state of mind. And when she returned home in January 1956, she was still disorientated and she suffered memory loss, although she gradually stabilised and found an even keel. So let me turn finally to Philip's side of the equation and the significance of his relationship with his mother for him. What you get from the correspondence, I think, is an overwhelming indication that Philip's attitude towards Eva was fundamentally one of duty, of care and love, notwithstanding the fact that he didn't want to live with her. He often carried out practical tasks around the house when he came to Loughborough on the frequent visits he made. Even at a distance, he was handling her problems, like she had a problem with getting a telephone installed, or a problem with the gas board, or something with a builder. It wasn't Kitty who sorted it out, it was Philip Larkin over in Hull by that time. There were tensions when he came to stay the weekend. They didn't always get on well. It seems when you look at the letters, he's forever apologising when he writes his letter the following Monday at how bad he was when he was there. So it was tough going. It was easier for him when he was writing at a distance than spending some time with her. That's partly also probably because he spent half the weekend in Leicester visiting Monica, so there was a tension for him in that too. But anyway, it's the poetry that matters most, going back to how Wim introduced this. And I have no doubt that Eva had a profound effect on Philip's abilities as a writer and as a poet. Some people would suggest that she was a kind of poetic muse, or one of several that he had. And certainly there's a handful of poems that have that biographical nature to them. To the Sea, the one I've already mentioned, is obviously one, which goes back to his parents' meeting. If you take a poem like Reference Point, that has its origins, I think, in the weekend visits home. This is the poem which has these lines in it. That was a pretty one I heard you call, from the unsatisfactory hall to the unsatisfactory room where I played record after record, idly wasting my time at home that you looked so much forward to. Now we know that's about Eva because he wrote in a letter to her, the one about you saying, that was a pretty one, is being broadcast early in February. That was in January 56. You never thought when you said it that you'd be repeated over the BBC.
In a much earlier poem, Hospital Visits, Larkin recalls the death of his father from the perspective of his mother. Eva had fallen and broken her wrist weeks before Sidney died and was being treated in the same hospital. Here is a poem of impending loss and widowhood. Thereafter, night and day, she came both for the sight of his slowing down body and for her own attending, and there by day and night, with her blithe bone mending, watched him in decay. There are others too, long sight in age, another personification of Eva's widowhood. Poems such as The Old Fools and Heads in the Women's Ward owe themselves to direct experiences of Eva's failing health and the institutional effects of what Philip saw of it in hospital ward and nursing home. So Eva's own life entered into his poetry in unsurprising ways, some of which he knew about, others she could never have guessed. She never got to see this be the verse. But beyond that, and inside the long years of their correspondence, I think there is a broader, more generic source of influence that connects to the generality of Larkin's poetry and its association with everyday human experiences and with the emotions they generate in us. The significance of small events and their defining pressure on individual psychology, as Alan Bennett put it. All of this emerges from the letters. Clive James, perhaps the most perceptive of the reviewers of the family letters, sees their correspondence with its myriad collection of everyday details as restoring Larkin's supply of the precious ordinariness that she represented, and a way of catching the more nuanced tones of everyday life. By far my most favourite poem featuring Eva is Mother, Summer, I. It is another fundamentally biographical poem depicting a mother and son united by their depressions, as James Booth would have it. Delve into the letters and you find endless references to the weather, to thunder, to feeding the birds and so on. Here they become transformed into something that soars above them. My mother, who hates thunderstorms, holds up each summer day lest swarms of grape dark clouds are lurking there. But when the August weather breaks and rain begins and brittle frost sharpens the bird-abandoned air, her worried summer look is lost. And I, her son, though summer-born and summer-loving, none the less am easier when the leaves are gone. By the beginning of the 1970s, Eva's capacity to cope with living on her own had decreased enormously, and it was a matter of great concern for Philip and his sister. They began to think about the need for her to have a visiting nurse, but before anything could be arranged, events took a dramatic turn. In January 1972, Eva fell and cracked a bone in her leg. After a brief spell in hospital, she was admitted to Berrystead Nursing Home in Syston. She would stay there until she died in November 1977. Sadly, she quickly began to lose the capacity to write letters, and those that survive are painful indicators of the growing struggle to communicate as dementia set in. Philip did his best to support her, sending daily postcards and visiting regularly. Judging from the letters, he may well have brought in some of the photographs we looked at earlier too, as a kind of memory jog. Eva was to survive for 5 years at Berrystead, buoyed up by the frequent weekend visits from Philip and the letters and postcards that arrived on an almost daily basis. In April 1977, Philip attended the wedding of his niece Rosemary here in Loughborough, and after the wedding went to visit his mother. In a letter to his sister Kitty, he described the visit. I took the flowers to Berrystead and a big stone vase. The girls were very kind, and in the end Mother had 5 flower arrangements in her room, looking delightful. Not that she really took them in. She was physically all right and ate her sandwiches and cake, and I think she knew me and smiled and tried to talk, but as before something has gone, and I'm afraid communication has broken down. Eva Larkin died on the 17th of November 1977, aged 91. Her headstone lies directly underneath Sydney's in the churchyard of St Michael's Church in Lichfield, hard to find amongst the overgrown foliage of the abandoned burial ground. Her death left Philip bereft. There is little doubt that he loved his mother more profoundly than anyone else in his life. There is even less doubt that he needed her, that in truth they needed each other. Their correspondence suggests that the nature of their relationship was essentially symbiotic and so powerful in its reach that in many ways it formed the underlying day-to-day driving force for both of their lives, especially during the 27 years when they lived apart. The day after she died, Philip had kept an appointment with Anthony Thwaite at All Souls College. He asked Thwaite to attend college prayers with him. I think my mother would have liked that, he told him. Within 8 years of her death, Philip Larkin himself would be gone. Weeks after his mother's passing, he had finally completed his great and uncompromising poem about death, O Bard, perhaps his greatest poetic achievement. After that, there was little more for him to say, and no mother to say it to.